you so much. I count myself so fortunate to have been at the National Endowment for the Arts, and during my 4-year term, there were a couple of insights that really came to the fore that I paid attention to during my travels. One of the insights that we discovered was that people across the nation want to feel like they belong, and the emphasis here is on the word feel. They're looking for meaning. They want something to touch their hearts. They don't want to be stuck. Instead, they really yearn to be able to expand and be inspired and to be able to imagine what their lives can be. They want to solve old problems in new ways. And so one of the quickest avenues to feeling like we belong is through acknowledging our identities. People want to have their identities recognized. They don't want to be force-fit into giving up one identity for another one. And the arts, that's what we can celebrate. The arts are leading the way in giving people a creative outlet to have this expansion. And a second insight that we discovered really was in a deeper awareness of what you are doing, of your work. Because we traveled to 50 states, the arts, and in this case, opera programs and activities, they're thriving across the nation in so many different ways. And so the work that you're doing is not only the expression of purity and beauty, but you're also creating an environment, a culture where the arts can thrive and provide a quality of life for those in the community. It is not easy to create a community culture because there's not this obvious linear process where one step automatically leads to the next step. It's a really messy process, and this process of creating a thriving culture never ends. So it's not like being in a clinical laboratory where everybody everywhere can replicate each step exactly alike in order to create a culture. But that's what you're doing. You as arts leaders are creating a culture where people can celebrate the arts and where people feel like they belong, each in our own ways. So that is, as Mark was saying, that is like connecting a community together. It is connecting. This is such a great time to feel good about the power that you have as a leader when it comes to creating a culture that honors our different perspectives and it connects us together at the same time. So you are tearing apart that old perception that there are only wonderful arts on the East and West Coasts. There are wonderful arts on the East and West Coasts, but that's not only where they are. No way. And people who still have that old perception are going to be astonished by the wonderful arts that are happening across the nation. In Fargo, North Dakota, in Missoula, Montana, in Boise, Idaho, in every state, every jurisdiction, and they're happening in so many different ways, through so many different approaches. So we used to define the arts in only one way, and now that old definition is expanding to include the multiple approaches in which the arts connect to people. And arts organizations are saying that by expanding this definition of the ways that the arts connect to people, they're also seeing an expansion of new donors, as opposed to only the same donors they've had in the past. And communities are looking for arts programs that can draw together like a giant magnet that vitality and that spirit that brings people together and can spark economic rejuvenation as well. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. Joining this morning are 7 of your colleagues who have delved deeper into creating experiences with opera and civic practice. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah.
Exactly.
Good. See, I do know how to count. So from Los Angeles, Mark Valdez, director, writer, producer, consultant in the area of theater arts, former executive director of NET, the Network of Ensemble Theaters. From Chicago, let's see, I'm just going to jump around. Yeah, there's a Chicago one. Puerto Rican Arts Alliance in Chicago, Carlos Hernandez, executive director of the premier Latino arts organization, which is also a partner with the Lyric Opera of Chicago. From Omaha, I'm jumping around again, Lauren Medici, Lauren is there. Lauren is the Director of Engagement Programs at Opera Omaha, which includes the Holland Community Opera Fellowship, and she specializes in making arts accessible in new environments and in collaboration with arts and non-arts sectors. And also from Omaha, Gwen Williams. Gwen is the Program Director for Collective for Youth, which connects resources and training and advocates to empower those out-of-school time providers who oversee activities for 7,000 elementary and middle school age students in the Omaha Public Schools. And they're also a partner with Opera Omaha. Washington, D.C., General Director Timothy O'Leary, General Director of the Washington National Opera, and including in many of his duties an active expansion with local and national audiences, including the greater Washington, D.C. community. From Chicago, Melissa Nahn. Melissa is the Executive Director and founding member of the chamber music group Fifth House Ensemble, professor of flute, consultant to the San Francisco Opera, educator in arts entrepreneurship, and Cayenne Harris from the Lyric Opera of Chicago, where she oversees the Lyric Unlimited program that's built over 40 partnerships in the Chicago area community. So welcome, panelists. And before we jump into our discussion together, we want to hear from each of you through an opening statement regarding your insights from your own experiences with opera and civic practice. And why don't we just go right down the table? Mark, we'll start with you.
Sure. Good morning, y'all. Thank you. Thank you. Or is it morning? Yeah, it's still morning. Great. So we were invited here to provide a provocation, and so take this in that spirit. If the regional theater movement of 60 years ago was about decentralization, I think we find ourselves in a moment of re-centralization, re-centering the American theater in our neighborhoods, town squares, and community centers, changing the way theater fits into everyday life. This is written about theater, but I think the same can be true of opera. We have a role to play in the daily life of our communities and citizens. We have more to offer than the season of performances. Our assets include the skill of convening, of bringing together people across political, cultural, ideological differences, and to make meaning of disparate ideas. We know how to build consensus. We know how to listen. We know how to communicate ideas, big ideas. We rehearse the making of worlds. We have the talent to envision those worlds and the craft to make them real. So why don't we apply these skills towards solving some of the most seemingly intractable problems facing our communities? Well, I have seen the enemy, and they are us. We are our own biggest obstacle to relevance. With the professionalization of art and art making, we have been taught and trained to believe that our sole job is to make art and perhaps to run an institution. So we focus on productions, which is no small thing because you all know this, it takes everything we have just to get to opening night. We don't have the bandwidth to look up. And our definition of what art is and our ideas of what art can accomplish gets smaller and smaller even as the world gets more and more complex. Civic practice is a form of artistic expression. It has its own aesthetic. It is art. It is the failure of artistic directors and managing directors, a failure of their imaginations to understand this. And until they do, I don't think anything is going to change.
Carlos?
Good morning. The word opera is foreign and sometimes even intimidating to many people who come from low-income or communities of color. As we move from one generation to another and improve our economic status, that feeling often carries on and does not disappear. Consequently, the word opera is not even in our vocabulary. However, when you have institutions like Lyric Opera Unlimited, who approaches communities of color with sensitivity, and a genuine openness to create collaborative partnerships that allows for first voice-driven projects, then you open the door for great things to happen now and in the future. Respecting first voice, developing trust, and letting a project develop under local community leadership is paramount to any successful partnership. Greatness does not occur by imposing traditional views. We need to listen, provide space and time for new evolving ideas, which will ultimately reflect works of art that people see themselves to be part of. We are a community that is ready to invest creative, culturally relevant content that is certain to engage new audiences. To revolutionize opera, we need to reinvent ourselves, demonstrate a commitment for inclusion on and off the stage, and valuing new approaches for arts and excellence. Thank you.
Thank you.
There are questions that come up frequently with stakeholders, specifically board and sometimes staff at my own organization, when they learn about or experience firsthand our civic practice work. The questions go something like this. This is really interesting, but what's in it for us? And is Lyric really the right organization to be offering this program? The idea that an opera company might have a role to play in addressing a critical community need or interest is somehow suspect. We're putting great art on the stage. Isn't that enough? And shouldn't everything we do somehow have a return for us? The questions being asked aren't unreasonable or unexpected. They arise because civic practice work can look and feel very different from other performances and programs offered by the company. I'll just add that I agree with Mark that it is art. Sometimes it involves devised works, original stories that feature amateur performers singing in decidedly non-operatic styles, or operas included alongside music of other cultures, creating a mirror of contrasting and sometimes surprisingly similar dimensions. Civic practice involves work developed collaboratively with people from outside the world of opera, meaning that control, artistic and otherwise, must be ceded and shared, and priorities of other entities allowed to emerge. This is not a compromise. Indeed, this is the point. Civic practice work demands skills that may be new: flexibility, adaptability, empathy, humility, and respect for other ways of doing things. It requires us to shift the focus off of our own priorities and consider deeply what is important to others, and more broadly, what is important to all of us. So what's in it for us? I hope you will dare to find out for yourselves.
I always like to say that civic practice should come with a warning label. You will be changed by the process of doing this work. You'll realize that a specific part of your training as a classical musician did not prepare you for this, specifically the part in which you learned to achieve excellence. That is the part that taught you that preparation means knowing the end result and perfecting it to the last detail. In both mindset and practice, that is completely counterculture to doing this work. Instead, you'll seek vulnerability. The idea that not knowing is what creates space for co-creation and for collaboration, as opposed to compromise or cooperation. So your work together is not a 1+1. It's actually something that couldn't have been imagined without that relationship. And that's a way of working that you will bring back to your own tribe as you create the new kinds of connective tissue between people in your own organization that is required to do this work well. You'll also seek flexibility, the ability to meet a participant where they are any given day, the ability to adapt to changing logistical circumstances, and to seamlessly move between the roles of facilitator, performer, educator, advocate, friend, and human being. And you will see others in new ways while you encourage seeing yourself in new ways as well. Together, you're going to find ways of working that extend beyond the expected modes of performance in music education. And in doing that, you'll develop projects that are a little bit less about achieving your own highest potential, but more about helping others achieve theirs in ways that are unexpected and beautiful. And in doing that, you will also redefine success, not through excellence, but through transformations, small and large, of the sort that we know can only be accomplished through the process of making art, and yet are seen and measured in ways that are completely outside of that frame.
Alrighty. Opera companies can begin to learn about the need of their communities by building trust within those communities. Humans do not appreciate a perceived outside entity telling them what they think they need. Seek out and ask community members to meet. Then meet them in spaces that are inclusive. Seek out a variety of ideas before making decisions regarding civic practice. Ensure expectations are clear and community members believe that they can depend on one another. Competency trust is also important and can be strengthened by admitting a mistake or expressing trust in others' abilities. Coming to the table willing to learn and teach. Trust is reciprocal. Genuine caring builds trust, but it does take time. Steve Jobs once said, connected experiences lead to synthesized new things. Civic practice enhances art making because it helps people connect experiences. Creating experiences open up the mind's flexibility, making it clear, making it easier to connect seemingly unconnected things together. The flow of ideas create energy and positive thoughts. Neuroscience and cognitive science results and research are increasingly providing information that correlates activity with intelligence, academics, social emotional success, and the development of skill sets in the highest form of the executive functions that are extremely valuable, at least in my role. Also in my role, I examine youth participation across activities to identify the factors that lead to our organizational outcomes. I have discovered that the more creative the process is within an activity, the higher self-ratings and social-emotional learning skills, the family and community partnerships, self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making all help the youth when working in the community.
2 years ago, Opera Omaha launched the Holland Community Opera Fellowship as a central core tenet of our new strategic plan and our vision for the future. Community voice has been essential to the fellowship since its inception. From the get-go, the first thing we did was create a community panel representing a cross-section of Omaha, including organizations, businesses, neighborhoods, and community groups. Gwen is on that panel. This panel is not an honorary appointment. It is not in name only to say, look who we have steering our fellowship. They actively guide and steer the fellowship, identifying priority issues, program development needs, potential partners, and opportunities across all parts of our greater community. The Community Opera Fellowship is only successful because of our community partners. These reciprocal relationships are nurtured to be long-term. They are not based on any one project or program or production. We work collaboratively with our partners to co-create programming that helps individuals, organizations, and communities reach their goals. We know that we cannot solve the most pressing issues in our community, like homelessness, income disparity, immigration, or segregation, by ourselves. But by working with partners who are experts in these fields and doing amazing work every day, we can offer our unique artistic resources to help meet goals together and be a more vibrant part of our community fabric. There is no fourth wall in civic practice. Our fellows and the fellowship are successful because of the personal relationships developed over the course of our work. Curiosity, vulnerability, compassion, empathy, and adaptability are key personality traits required of our fellows day in and day out. This work is not for every artist, and that is fine. This is why we ask our community to be involved in the selection of our fellows. Community partners and panel members participate in a 5-day site visit selection process. Everybody who meets our fellows over those 5 days offers feedback from which the panel, not Opera Omaha staff, ultimately decide who is best suited to do this work within their communities and with their neighbors. For us, civic practice boils down to being a creative and artistic resource to our community. That is the only way we can be more relevant and more accessible. And we have to include that community and community voice in every step of the way. So I encourage you to think, what more could you be doing if you truly focused your energy on your community and what they need?
Are we an arts organization or a social service organization? In 2013, when I was General Director of Opera Theater of St. Louis, a board member asked this question as we wrestled through the creation of a new strategic plan. Over months of the process, the question persisted, threatening to divide trustees and staff into an art faction and a social faction. Is art an end in itself? Is it only a means to an end? When opera subscriber and Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg is asked whether the Constitution requires interpretation or whether its words should be taken at face value, she answers that the real question is what is meant by the opening words, "We the people." In 1789, she says, the phrase was not understood to include her. It did not include women or African Americans or many others. Now we understand the words differently. The answer we settled on about the mission of Opera Theater of St. Louis was to suggest that we understand our name differently, Opera Theater of St. Louis, and to define St. Louis as the entirety of our community. We exist to serve an art form and to serve the whole of the community. Now I work for a company with an even more troublesome name. The Washington National Opera. And Francesca Zambello and I are working with our board and company on a new strategic plan. So far, one thing that everyone seems to agree on is that we should try to live up to all 3 words in our name. Thank you.
Thank you, panelists. Thank you so much. I hope that sets the tone for our conversation today. So we've got some questions, and we're going to learn a lot from your insights. Let's start with you, Carlos Hernandez. You made some comments about allowing a project to develop under local community leaders and really respecting that first voice, because it's such an important step to creating trust. So could you walk us through some examples of the beginning steps, those early steps between Puerto Rican Arts Alliance and the Lyric Unlimited in terms of demonstrating this respect? Was it messy? Was it clean? Was it obvious? How did you do it?
All of the above.
Okay.
But I think that the most important part was that Lyric has had an experience, and I think they have a program already set up that allows them, and they had some previous experience in going into communities of color. And when they came to Puerto Rican Arts Alliance, they were very much open to a relationship that can start in the community, a relationship that would be able to develop in the community through its leader. And so that was very important for us. We did a couple of things. We did some small steps. We went ahead and did a project with a local school in our center. We did a small community concert that led up into a larger concert. But those were building steps earlier on. The relationships that you have to build is trust. I think someone here mentioned that. Trust is very, very relevant. And you also have to have an organization that comes to you, in this case Lyric, and is open to creativity to come from within your community.
Great, great. Timothy O'Leary, does every new community partnership require the same steps when you're working on a project together? Is there a template that you can show us on how this everybody should follow it?
Jane, I loved how you introduced the whole panel by saying that it is not a straight line. So I have experienced that there's a pattern often, but not a template, and that every time it requires a very large investment of time with uncertain results. And so I guess one thing I know that is an axiom is that things, for this work to end up being meaningful, requires a long runway of time, literally months and years before you're trying to actually execute something that matters. So, I mean, I think it's funny. Back in 2011, I did a project in St. Louis that required the creation of a steering committee of community stakeholders, and in that steering committee, we got together the people who were likely to become the most upset at what we were doing, and asked them if they would join a committee to help us decide what to do. And that wasn't my idea. That was the idea of a person in St. Louis who I was incredibly lucky to meet, who said to me, you know, the process will be part of the result, and that we should value the process that we undertook for more than a year before this opera production. So at the time, I had never heard of this idea, and now I feel like on this panel we just heard like 7 people talk about this idea of building a committee of stakeholders. And we just have started such a committee in Washington. We're doing an opera by Tazewell Thompson and Jeanine Tesori called Blue. Lyric Unlimited is doing the same opera. It's about an African-American police officer whose son is killed by a white police officer. And so we have formed a steering committee. And I thought, will this work? Again, will people be willing to join? There's so much of this discussion going on in our community. Will people answer my email when I initiate contact? And again, people are willing. People are generous with their time. People are, more than one person who we contacted said to me, you know, I'd be honored to be part of that work. So if there's a template, it's that, you know, trust is only created through discussion over time. So that's what I'd say.
Thank you. Lauren, you too were assembling a panel, actually all of you were, but you too were assembling a panel related to the Holland Community Opera Fellowship. It sounds like you brought together people who on paper looked like they were coming from different realms and different perspectives. Did you first select the right people to be on your community panel, or do you first identify the subject matter or the topics that you want to address and then select the people? How does that work?
So the panel, and actually all of the programming when we were getting started was talking about time, came out of about 75 meetings with different community leaders and programs and potential partners that were trying to suss out not just who might be a great fit for the panel, who might be a great fit for partner programming, or who could just help us identify some of those community needs that we don't know about. And so out of those conversations, we could then kind of identify who we had talked to and would fit those categories. Some people fit all 3. Some people didn't fit any of them. And so then the panel was really built out and based around thinking about who would bring us really great perspective that we needed to hear and different perspectives that we needed to hear. And we didn't know until they all got together how well they'd work together. But it's a really important conversation that happens every time we have a panel meeting, and they have worked together, and over the last 2 years, we've had some people who have cycled off the panel, and we've added some new voices, and now we're in a place where after 2 years, we can expand that panel a little bit and add some more voices to the panel. But it wasn't a straightforward process. We had some people who we invited to be on the panel because we knew about them beforehand, and we had some people who were on that panel who no one at Opera Omaha had ever met before or ever knew, but through those community conversations and continuing to ask, what do we not know, and who do we not know? Who's doing great work in this community that we don't know about and has no idea who we are? And that's how it was built. So it was a very circuitous process, and it took a lot of time. Sure. But the end result has been really powerful.
Gwen Williams. Gwen, you bring a wonderful background and training in a non-arts area, if you have to put categories on them. And so your undergraduate degree is in psychology, and you're working on your master's degree in industrial psychology as well. And so you have experience also in the after-school programs, of course. So what is it about the arts, from your perspective, what is it about the arts that make civic practice projects so effective?
Well, for me, what I've seen is the creative process really engaging people. So what I try to look for, well, when joining the fellowship, I want to tell you that Lauren is amazing. First of all, I just love Lauren over there.
You can say that. We can pat each other on the back.
But working with the artist, we wanted to bring, as far as, you know, the youth piece, we wanted to bring people from all areas of the community into the youth world and invite them in and say, hey, how can we work together to create opportunities for youth that don't look like any other experience. So we invited lots of people in, then Opera Omaha was one of those people that were also brought in. But we bring people in that don't necessarily know how to work with youth or have been around little kids, so that looks differently. So in my role, I try to coach and train them on what that looks like. You are going to be touched. So if you're not okay with being physically touched, then this is probably not the place for you. So kids of all kind want to feel like they're being seen, and they love to be interactive with other adults. So I coach and train on that. I think it is important to show people that the creative process really helps anyone, whether it's youth or adults, tell their story. And so kids that are living in situations such as poverty or abuse, they need an outlet. They need a way to be able to tell their story. And I think that opera is one of those great ways where they can learn how to tell their story. So who else is telling their story, and who can tell their story better than themselves? But they need to know how to do that. And what is a safe way and a safe place to do that. So in partnering with Opera Omaha, gave that space and that time to do that. And so teaching the artists how to work with our community really was a benefit to both parties.
Thank you. Melissa, thank you. Melissa, you talked in your opening remarks about how this transformation occurred within you or within the artists when we're involved in civic practice. So this suggests to me that how you do something is just as important as what you do. So can you give us an example about how standing in the midst of this ambiguity, especially in a new project, can be so rewarding? And does it affect your own artistry, your own musicianship, your own performances?
In every possible way. I think just to set a context for this, Fifth House does a lot of long-term work with organizations who are helping people transition from homelessness or incarceration into stable housing and employment. We've been doing that over the last 4 years, and before that, our work was collaborative with classroom teachers and CPS. And when we started this work in social practice and civic practice, we actually partnered with Loyola University and their Center for Urban Research and Learning. And it's a collaborative team of researchers in the field of social work. And I'm getting to your question in a way that helps you to understand why That core transformation within the artist is so important that partnering with the research team outside of the field of music and evaluating these programs was really important. We thought that we would see in what they came back to us with a lot of outcomes in perhaps ability to create music, write music, perform music, but also address the goals that our partners articulated to us, things like job readiness skills, processing trauma outside of traditional therapy. What we saw instead was that we were seeing the same results in every location. Mindfulness first, agency, empowerment, collective decision-making, and creativity. And when they talked about creativity, it was creative problem solving and the ability to envision a better world for yourself and the agency to get yourself there. So the thing that was more important than that, perhaps, to your question, is that they noticed that it was not the curriculum or any of the activities that we did that produced those results. It was the mindsets and behaviors of the teaching artists themselves in the delivery, design, and creation of those programs that made them happen. And so when we think about that, those behaviors were flexibility, role adaptability, ability to meet participants where they are. And that became core to our process of designing work, of helping other organizations who are much larger than ours create this work. And I have to give a lot of credit to San Francisco Opera when they brought us in, that part of the purpose was to help them create these new relationships and develop programming. But a very intentional part of the process was, how do we learn new ways of interacting with others and amongst ourselves that will facilitate this work happening in the best possible way?
Thank you. Mark, you talk about building consensus as well, such a valuable skill. What kinds of artistic skills did you experience employing when you were talking about building consensus together with non-arts partners?
I first have to say, I have a little crush on all of you. So I'm just kind of enjoying that.
These are important sidebar comments.
These are so important.
Yes.
So love crushes. Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. So I think sometimes we think about consensus as meaning that we are all in agreement, and I don't necessarily take that to be consensus. I think for me, like, what I found is that when trying to reach consensus, everybody feels heard. And you may disagree, and you may ultimately say, like, I don't know, but you trust, you feel heard enough that you can trust the people around you to keep moving forward. You know, so I think, so for me, like it's thinking about consensus in that way. And I think in this work that we've talked about and everybody's, shared, just like how much partnerships are important and how ultimately you're just gonna find yourself in things that you're not expert at, that you have to trust, and just the time for that to happen. You move at the speed of trust. It's everything, So and as you do that, then you continue to build buy-in and trust, and it just ripples out from everything that you do, so that now, like, if everybody feels heard, if everybody feels trusted, if everybody's kind of moving together, then it just it provides that solid foundation to keep moving.
Okay, thank you. Cayenne, in your own building of community partners, do you have specific criteria that mimicked or were the same or aligned with your colleagues here, or were there some differences that related to specifically to Chicago?
Well, so much of what has been said resonates deeply. I don't think that there's any one kind of type of partnership. Really, each relationship is unique. And again, that's part of the challenge of this work. I think we all want blueprints that tell us, here's step 1, here's step 2, here's step 3, and you will get the result that you're hoping for. But the reality is, every organization that you partner with has its own unique kind of set of circumstances and very specific needs and interests. They also have varying levels of being able to respond when you're interested in getting that response. And so often what I find with partnerships is that, and this will resonate, I'm sure, as opera companies, we sometimes want to connect when we have a project that we think there's a nice fit, right? We're doing X production, it's on these themes, and so then we're gonna seek out those organizations that may be working with populations who also are dealing with those themes. And it's unfortunately a bit transactional. We are looking to connect to a whole host of people or to validate something about what we're doing. It's not wrong, and sometimes those partnerships can be very fruitful, so I don't mean to paint it in a really negative light. But what can also happen is that no matter how a partnership is initiated, if you are successful in actually maintaining that relationship and developing that relationship, it's really interesting the kinds of work that can come out of that over time, and the ideas that can bubble up when they're not in a time-compressed kind of situation. So I think if there's an ideal in terms of partnerships, for me, it is thinking about how you can build relationships over time, perhaps initiate them without a project already devised, and really allow for a process of listening, getting to know each other, showing up, really having curiosity about that organization's events and their operations and sort of what happens day to day. And that's where some really interesting and fruitful work, I think, can happen. And also that trust gets built.
So just the criteria of setting the tone on how we will work together is a critical piece. Thank you. Carlos, you bring up a perception that sometimes the word opera is intimidating to some. What are some of the ideas that you've experienced on how to connect opera to communities that have traditionally perceived opera to be only for some but not for others?
Well, let me just share. I'm going to just share a story with you about my experience with Lyric, and perhaps I can answer your question in sharing this story. So I run an organization that primarily has a music school that teaches children, underprivileged, low-income children, how to play the national instrument of Puerto Rico, which is the cuatro, and the string instrument program teaches guitar and violin. So we have a music component, and it made sense for us to align ourselves with a project like Lyric was bringing to us. And besides that, we run a program, a major concert that we call the National Cuatro Festival, an Emmy Award-winning event that we had. And so I've had an audience that has developed itself from listening traditional Puerto Rican folk music to experiment other areas of music. And so for me, while I thought that opera was not something that immediately resonated with my own community, the Lyric opportunity that came our way created a win-win situation for us to present music that otherwise our community would not necessarily go out of their way to listen. And so I took a bold step with this because I really meant it that the word opera in many community of color is foreign, and it carries on to generation to generation unless you make an intervention. And I think the intervention that happened here with Lyric was very timely because what we had done for the last 20 years is presented music and evolutionize and continue to evolve and hit the refresh button on our concert. And this was a particular moment that we wanted to experience and our community was ready for. And it really was revolutionizing in terms of listening to something that many of the people in our community had not listened to. Some had, I must say that, but I would say at least 50% did not experience what opera is. So when we had a project called Lyric, Caribe Unlimited, Caribe Clásico, what Lyric did was that it provided us the tools to take on the leadership to present music that people could identify with an arrangement of people on stage that looked like our audience, with an arrangement of music that people identified with. So when that all came together, I was very amazed and very pleased that we had hit the mark and that we had opened the door for new experiences for our community to enjoy through this word called opera that does not necessarily resonate in our community on an ongoing basis because it is seen as a music piece that is foreign to our community. So we had people walking out from this concert that we had with the partnership. We had lyrics saying to me, "I didn't know this music existed. I didn't know that this was something that was part of our culture." But we fused these pieces together that made it a great experience for us to hit the mark and open up a new opportunity for us to expand and develop new programming opportunities for our community, hopefully for Lyric as well. So we're always looking for hitting the refresh button. And I think when we hit the refresh button here, we hit it on our side, and Lyric hit it on their side. So it was a great experience, and I think that's how we were able to do that.
Thank you. Gwen, you talked about how you would position opera as not just another activity in terms of the after-school programming. Tell us some of the behind-the-scenes stories about how you saw the youth respond. Did you see any changes in them?
Quick answer, yes.
Okay.
Yes, there definitely is a difference with youth when they participate in the opera program. The opera program shows the youth how to create characters and how to be a hero or heroine, and then how can you be a hero or heroine of your own life. And so then that gets them thinking about, okay, what else can I do? So we want the kids to have resilience. We want them to have growth mindset. We want them to think about their future in positive ways. And how else can we do that but showing them creativity and using creativity as a way through certain hard situations. So if you put up 2 slides of a brain, and the brain that is engaged in active creative process has a lot more lights flashing than that brain that's just thinking about something without involving that creative process. So there's a lot more going on. You involve both sides of the brain, which then you become a more thoughtful thinker when you're based in creativity. And then it just really flows with the children, and then they can see, oh, well, maybe I didn't need to yell at that teacher yesterday. I could have thought of a different way to do that. But now that I've seen I have a different outlet, now I have an outlet to use that energy and to be more thoughtful about how I address certain situations. And so when I've seen it, I'll give you an example. We had some operas, the opera fellows come to one of our after-school programs, and we had a situation where just a week prior, one of the students' parents had committed suicide. So there were a lot of feelings around that subject. This was a beloved student. Everybody knew this particular student. This student had a 2-parent household, which at this particular school was not the norm. So they thought that this kid was the prized child. You have a 2-parent household, you have everything, but then for this to happen to them, devastated the building. So then when I went to work with the fellows, I let them know, hey, before you go into this location, you need to know here's what happened. And then you're not gonna be able to maybe do your lesson the way you wanted to, but you may need to address some of those other feelings. And having them know what was going on in the school, having a partner that actually knew what was going on in the school, so when they went in, they're not going in blind. They know what's going on, and so they were able to help that group kind of really flesh out some of their feelings that they were having about that event.
So the conditions and the context around it was just as important to know about, besides just the lesson itself.
Absolutely.
Lauren, in terms of the Holland Fellow, how long does the fellow stay involved in the program? Really, the question is, how long does it take for the fellow to develop this long-term relationship with the community to get the project going?
So our fellows are with us for 2 years. So we just have our first 2 fellows who have left us. We have our first alumni. In my head, that hasn't happened yet because they're coming back in August, and that's not real. But that time and that relationship, because they're with us for a 2-year term, and they're not with us over the summer. They're with us for a 9-month kind of school year schedule. But they're with us full time during that. They're a full-time part of the staff, and this is their job. This is the priority for them to do. We're not trying to cobble together a different teaching artist residency. We're not trying to do that. But the relationship with the partners starts with myself and our fellowship manager, because we know the fellows will be here for 2 years. And we also, do some initial needs assessment and some sussing out to see who's going to be a good collaborative partner and buy into this program before we bring the fellows into that conversation. And the program development time can be really short. We can have a meeting with a partner in the end of November, another meeting in December, and then we're going to pilot a program in January. Or we've been working to start working with incarcerated youth, and we've been trying for 2 years to do that, and we're moving on, and we've made that relationship. Our fellows haven't even met that partner yet, because we're not at that stage. Those fellows are going to meet that partner in August when they come back, and they'll start the program development then. Because there's a lot of relationship work for us that goes in before we're even talking about a project, or what a workshop's gonna look like, or are we gonna do this every week or every other week. That's 10 steps down the road in many cases. So the time varies, and it varies by project, and it varies by partner. And sometimes partners have in mind something they would love for us to collaborate with that's already on their calendar, and can we make that work in that time frame? And let's do that. And sometimes it's more of an ongoing process of what are your organizational goals, maybe what do you need. Maybe there's nothing right now where you can fit, or you're going through a staff change and now is not the right time to add something new. That doesn't mean that we don't still have a relationship and they're not still a partner with us. We have over 40 partners as part of the fellowship. That does not mean that we actively have 40 projects happening at a time. So it varies. And sometimes it's a really slow process, and sometimes it's a faster process. But all of that also depends on what the partner wants and needs, and how long their planning timeline is. We work with some partners who it is June, and we have to talk to them now if there's anything that we would possibly like to do next May. And there are other partners that we work with that we're having a conversation in September, and they have in mind that we will do something workshop-wise or something in October. So it just depends, and that timeline is all based on that relationship.
Did you set a 2-year, when you were creating the fellowships, did you decide on it being 2 years for a specific reason?
So that decision was made before I got to Upper Omaha, but that decision is also part of this idea of we want this to grow and we want this to spread, and what I talked about with this idea of this work is not for every artist. And there's a ton of training that goes into it. In the first 2 years of this program, we've done over 250 hours of training just within the fellowship. And so what that means is the idea that now that we have these alumni who are going to go take this into anything that they do from here on out, moving forward, they're out in the opera world and have done this well, and have had training and have built programs. So I think that idea that it does rotate and it is a fellowship and it's not something that is full-time and you're going to sign up to do this for, the unknown length of time. I signed up to do it for an unknown length of time, and I'm really happy about that. And we have our fellowship manager who's there full-time and not on a 2-year term. So there are members of this team who are like that. But that idea that this is training and preparing artists to do this work, it's really central to this program. This is not just for Omaha. We have alumni out there. We have 2 of them. If you would like to do this program in your city, I will put you in touch. They're fantastic. But that's part of it. We can't say that, we're just going to do this only in one place and maybe affect change. We're affecting change in Omaha. Next step, it's all of you.
Thank you. Tim, we have heard some experiences from arts leaders across the nation when they engage in civic practice that they actually have expanded to new people and connecting to them, including new donors. Any experience there with the Washington National Opera or your previous experience in St. Louis?
I'm hoping to have this experience at Washington National Opera, but have only been in the job for not quite a year, so it's early to say. But yeah, in St. Louis, we saw 2 kinds of things happen as we developed a real sense of mission and emphasis about our contribution to civic life. So 2 good outcomes were that some new donors appeared who were not previously supporting us, but then much more noticeably, donors who had supported us at one level suddenly started to support us at much higher levels.
Because?
Well, I think Roger said it well yesterday on the panel. He said that donors today are making an investment in their community, and they expect that if they're contributing their financial resources, there's going to be a benefit to the community. I think there are the donors who gave to their arts organizations in their community out of a sense that art was just inherently worth supporting. This is no longer as persuasive a case for many donors. It's funny. I remember being the first time at the table at Opera America, 2010, as a new general director, and Mark Skorka, we were in one of these get-together with all the general director meetings. It was all white guys. And Mark said, "What do you think about the word civic? Are any of you using the word civic to describe your roles for your organizations?" And there were a couple of people who were like, "Yeah, I mean, sort of." But most people were like, "No, we're art. We do art." And now I feel like we keep using the metaphor of civic fabric. And there are a lot of people talking about this. One of the things that's happened is that the fabric in our culture has become unwoven in many ways, in part maybe because the old fabric needed to be pulled apart. And obviously we're in the middle of doing that. But when I hear all these stories, what I hear is the activity of what a lot of people refer to as reweaving. We're putting it back together in ways that are new and better. And that the reweaving happens very, very gradually. But I do think that's essentially what we're doing when we, in the arts, are offering what we have to people in our community who are not previously involved in our art form. It's about how can we actually be woven together.
Thank you. Panelists, how do you measure success? Number of tickets sold? How many people attending? How do you measure success in a civic practice project? Anybody?
Yeah, I'd like to start with something there, and this is actually related to your question about donors, actually. Okay. So, you heard me speak earlier about how we measure success through participant outcomes, and that the first year of doing this, as you've heard as an ongoing theme, this is not a short-term process. This is not a situation where you may even know what you're measuring in the first year, and that was definitely the case for us. We didn't know what outcomes we were looking for. But once we were able to articulate outcomes that were outside of the frame of the arts, it opened up a new way of talking about the reason why these programs exist, and it also opened up a completely new avenue for places we could approach for funding in an interesting way. So, we would go to a foundation thinking we would be in their arts portfolio, and they might say, what we're doing is actually probably closer to something that's in their social practice portfolio. And suddenly the ask triples, and they've been a partner with us for many years. So that's just another thing that I'll say is it's not just existing donors or existing donor pools in the arts. It's actually, if you can talk about and measure your work in ways that sit completely outside of the arts framework, it's very effective in both helping you design better programming and then also being able to communicate that in ways that donors can attach to for the first time.
Thank you. So I don't know if you heard, but you asked that question, and Tim immediately said yes, and I immediately said no.
I was kidding.
But that's real. Success looks different for us with every different partner that we work with. And when you're saying that the goal of the program is to help your partners achieve their goals, that inherently means that every time it's different. I'll tell you 2 different success stories. So the first one is with our creativity workshops we do with a homeless shelter in Omaha. And we're there once a month as part of ongoing programming. In the beginning, individuals who are in a substance abuse portion of the homeless shelter are mandated to attend this programming. What has happened is some of those individuals like the programming so much, they keep coming after they're no longer mandated to be in the programming. That's great. But the other thing that's happened is they've developed a relationship with opera and our fellows to the point where we had members of that class who organized amongst themselves to get to one of the fellows' recitals at our Sunday morning gallery concert series because they wanted to support those fellows as artists, because the fellows had been in those creativity workshops supporting them as humans. And so that, to me, is a success. A different success does come from the numbers. We've reached in 2 years over 18,000 people, and I would estimate a solid 75% of those people we would never have reached without having this program. So it's different every time, and there's quantitative success and there's qualitative success. Yes?
So I think as a nonprofit organization, I always think about, once the curtains close, what have we achieved? And the most important thing for me, a couple of things that I wrote down here is, have we increased our audience at the end of the day, once this performance is over? Will it impact future programming opportunities for my organization? Does it raise the organization profile? And obviously, we are concerned about funding. And does it increase new funding opportunities given that we did this project? So I really want to emphasize that we can always have your relationship for a one-time shot, one-time night opportunity, but that's not what I look for. I look for other things to measure success, and these are certain attributes that I attribute my success for.
I will just say that I think sometimes in the opera world we have a disease of calling everything a success, and it's a compulsion because we're working so hard, whether it's putting art on the main stage or our civic practice work or anything, but there's so much time and human resource and dollars that go into every endeavor that we take on, that what I find is that we really want to call everything a success. I want to posit that some of our civic practice work, and maybe some of all of our work, is actually a process rather than a product. Mm-hmm. So it's not, the question about whether it's a success or not, and not to diminish any of the success measures that people have already put out there, that question itself may have a flaw. Part of what we're doing, and I love the term civic practice, because the word practice implies something that it's not a pursuit of perfection. It is not a pursuit of excellence in the way that we have traditionally thought of that. It is a process where all kinds of things happen. Some of them are wonderful. Some of them are hard. Some of them are scary. Some of them take us to places where we're uncomfortable. And so in a way, I feel like we have to question the question and really consider that our goal isn't necessarily success. You know, our goal is addressing a critical need or interest. Our goal is trying to change something or bring about something different than what existed before. So that's maybe a little too philosophical, but I think that might be worth sharing.
Well, that sounds like success.
I think that naming the goal is the first step, and I always describe the goal of this kind of work as connection. You know, you can say creating connection and therefore greater justice in our culture. And then once you name goals that are that big, measurement is very difficult. Which is why people, and I was kidding when I said ticket sales were the measurement, but people, we like to measure things like ticket sales or numbers because they're quantifiable. And it doesn't mean that we should not measure them. But there's the old, we're all now familiar with these logic models of moving from activities to outcomes to impact. And one of the most powerful things to do is to every time step back and say, well, what's the ultimate impact that we're trying to achieve? And then find the ways to get at whether there's any chance that we've moved the needle on impact. And you can only do that by combining, I like the phrase, no numbers without stories and no stories without numbers.
Well, listening to everyone up here just makes me believe that everyone should be a part of youth development in some kind of way, because youth development is an avenue to increase donorship because it allows you to reach donors that you wouldn't necessarily reach before. I meet with our donors annually, and we talk about programming, and when I talk about Opera Omaha, they're like, you're doing what? They're like, that's very interesting, and sometimes our donors are the same. So they're like, wow, we didn't know that you guys were collaborating that way. When we also talk about youth development, we talk about the future and what it looks like, you know, whether it's for opera or just for arts in general, what does the future look like? Well, in order for it to have a future, we need people there. And so if we're gonna look at, okay, who's gonna be those people there in that future, we need to really focus in on that youth piece and looking at, okay, so what types of jobs are out there in the arts field. I will tell you that the youth in our programs in Omaha do not know about half the jobs that are creative here in this space. I saw a model of a stage that blew me away out there, like whoever did that is amazing. That to me was like, I took a picture of it because it was so awesome. But that's all STEAM. So the whole thing, the science, the technology, the arts, and math, is all together. So how can we really engage people in knowing like what else is out there as far as career fields? I've heard a bunch of careers today that I didn't know about either. I'm like, oh my God, I have to go back and tell someone. So this is a very creative space. And if we really want to create a future for opera, then we really need to align ourselves with that youth development piece, because that's where right now the money is. In those STEM career fields, that's where the money is. And we need to start sharing that information with as many people as possible.
So let's arm ourselves with some talking points. Sometimes we hear board members of arts organizations comment about these projects in the community, and they'll say, of course, we have been reaching out to neighborhoods for years to connect them to our programs, and this is nothing new to us. They are our outreach programs. Is a civic practice program another outreach program? And if it is different, what's the difference?
Well, it's not the same to me, so I'll tell you that right now.
Okay. Continue.
So, as an African-American woman, to say, yes, I've heard that, well, we do outreach, but don't do something to me, include me.
Thank you. Anybody else? Okay.
Absolutely.
I'm going to follow up with that and tell you that we no longer use the word outreach in any Opera Omaha materials, ever. Yes. I highly encourage you to think about the language that you're using when you're talking about programs in communities, and thinking about how do people want to be heard, and listening and thinking in that way. And I think outreach has a connotation to it that we have this thing and we are bringing it to you, and aren't you so grateful that you've had the opportunity to have this thing? And if someone came to us and said that, we'd be so upset, and yet that's what we would go and do. And so it's different in that way because of the collaborative nature of it, because we're asking the questions in the first place. So I think it's inherently different.
Yeah, Jane, I would say a lot of the very traditional programs, engagement programs, outreach programs, however they're termed at various organizations, and I share your philosophy, have been about introducing opera. And the starting point has been we are attempting to, sort of proselytize about our art form and teach you something that we feel is important, that every child should have this exposure or this opportunity. And the one thing that's really different around civic practice is the starting point is not we want to teach you or introduce you to opera. The starting point is a dialogue about what's going on in that particular community, what the needs and interests are, and to a certain degree a negotiation about, are there resources, are there, what could we do together that might help to address that? So opera may end up being a part of it. In some cases, opera is a kind of small part of it. I mentioned in my opening statement that sometimes the work looks really different than other work the organization undertakes. And I think that that can be surprising and provocative to people who are very attached to the idea that we need to introduce young people to opera. I also think it's cool to introduce young people to opera. So again, it's not as though we're choosing between these things. But civic practice has quite a different starting point and a different intent. And to me, I have to say, it's just thrilling that opera companies are thinking in this way and moving toward really expanding how we think about the work that we do with children, with adults, with senior citizens, how the arts are actually, it's much more participatory. It's much less about sort of imparting information. I think that's really healthy for us as a field.
I want to be careful, because as we're having this conversation, this feels more and more removed from the work. Like, you know what I mean? Like I'm hearing all of this, and I agree fully, deeply in my heart, and I don't want to lose the fact that it's art. It's ultimately, it's good art. It's interesting art. And it's art that helps. It's art that matters. It's art that allows access and entry. And so I just don't, I really, really think that is the problem that we face, that we don't see this as art, and it gets removed, and the more and more, and it's like it was an anything, that when we separated artistic merit from artistic quality, that a division emerged. And they don't have to be different. So just kind of want to just make sure that gets kind of stays somewhere in the middle.
I think one of the things that is so joyful when you do this kind of stuff is that when we're involved in these kinds of relationships, and then everyone's focusing on the same art, the music. The thing that I have experienced over and over is, my God, that music works. You know, it does its job. You get people who wouldn't find themselves listening to the same piece of music together, listening to the same piece of music, and it does its job. That people feel connection to the characters and the situations and the emotions, and connection to each other. I've seen it over and over and over again, and it makes me think, right, this is worth doing.
And Melissa, you had alluded to also how the art of civic practice has also transformed in terms of empowering your own artistry, but further thoughts related to this?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's hard to have a conversation about civic practice without bringing up Michael Rhodes' definitions, which he's done such a beautiful job of articulating what we're doing. So, you know, studio practice being what we're really used to, the idea of creating a work of art and bringing it to a public and they engage as an audience. Or social practice, which ends up being we want to explore an important social topic, so we invite a partner to participate with us, to develop content, to participate in conversations and activities, those kinds of things. Civic practice is the sort of thing that emerges only through an invitation from an external partner to address an issue that is completely outside of the arts. And it's your creativity as an artist. The superpower that you bring to the table is in helping to understand how you can do that. Because here's the thing, when I was speaking earlier about how you will see others with new eyes, but you will also encourage them to see you with new eyes as well, the invitation and that first conversation is so important. We've had so many arts organizations, perhaps all of us in earlier stages of our lives included, who have trained partners to know that all we can do is perform and teach, and that when we come in, it's outreach, so there will be a menu of things that we can do, and please choose from one of these. But when you come in with an open conversation and you say, tell me what you're succeeding at right now. You know, tell me what is challenging to you in the next year, what are your major action issues? They're gonna answer in the frame that you know that they know that you're a musician. You know, and it's your job to push them outside of that frame and say, I know you're talking about events or perhaps educational programs, but let's talk more broadly about things that you're thinking about and working on. And what that means is it stretches your creativity as an artist to understand how you can help. And I think my favorite example from Michael is when they were doing a project in Milwaukee and they found that there was a group of people who was not participating in their project. They couldn't get out of their homes because the street lights were too short. And it was too short for them to get across the street. So they built a ship, and their actors walked people across the street for as long as it took. And it became so profoundly uncool after a certain period of time for local lawmakers, local media to not get involved in this, that the lights were changed. So it's helpful to note that that's something that came out of a social practice work that they were doing, that civic practice is a component perhaps of the work, and that it's helpful to know what you're doing at any given time without judgment. Studio practice is wonderful, social practice is wonderful, civic practice is wonderful. Any company and any project can have components of all of those and flexibly move between those modes.
Cayenne, I believe you mentioned in some cases the actual opera production that we know is sometimes a smaller part of the civic practice project, but let's flip that a minute. Are there specific elements within the opera production format that lend themselves naturally to creating these meaningful partnerships?
Yes. In many ways, I think opera is this really resilient and flexible art form. It can withstand a lot of different treatments. You know, it has more capacity than we give it credit for. And what I mean by that is the musical language can change entirely. It can have a real focus on movement rather than acting. It has a sort of, infinite range of possibilities. And when you begin co-creating with a group of people who are not trained in the classical arts, your own discovery of the art form kind of grows exponentially because it has all this possibility. So now, some people really want to define opera in a very narrow way, and that way means it can only include classically trained singers. It has to have certain elements. And I think that part of what I hope everyone will think a little bit about today is that rigid structure serving us? Are there ways that this art form can truly grow and expand and evolve? It doesn't mean we're going to lose anything that we currently do. I think there's always that sort of sense of threat. But we have room to widen the tent and really think about how this art form can do all sorts of incredible new things when we're working with people from different backgrounds, with different creativity, with different kinds of skills, with different musical traditions, all those sorts of things. So I've been really impressed with what has been created by people who had no prior insights into opera, but using the sort of building blocks of opera as the starting point.
We talk a lot in the fellowship about opera is all of the things. And what that means is we have all of those things at our disposal. So we can do a writing workshop and talk about storytelling and poetry and lyrics, or it can be an instrumental music workshop, or we can talk about the visual arts in sets and costume. We can talk about the technology that goes into it. We have all of these elements that are part of opera that we have at our fingertips and can use. And so it's about finding what element of opera connects for people. And we found that for almost anybody, one element of opera sparks for them. And that's what we're trying to find.
Tam?
I'll tell a quick story, which is along these lines. We just had our first meeting of the community steering committee for the Blue project. And so we have representatives at the table from social justice, civil rights, education, religious organizations, law enforcement, criminal justice reform. It was a really incredible group of people, all of whom had self-selected to be there, obviously, so they were predisposed. But still, sitting around the table, there's a lot of like question mark in the air, like, why are we here, and is this going to work? And then the person that we engaged as our facilitator had this brilliant idea, which is let's introduce them to the work itself by having the members of that committee do a table read of a scene from the opera. And it was like one after another, everyone read a line, the next person read a line, the next person read a line. Well, by the time we read this unbelievably emotional scene in the opera in that style, everybody was moved deeply and on board for the project no matter what. You know? And that was a fast progression from a bunch of people who barely knew each other and were skeptical of this idea to common purpose. And that was the art doing its job. And also, it was this, diverse set of strands of our community weaving themselves together in a surprising way, so, for what it's worth.
Any final comments on any unanticipated benefits that you've discovered through the Civic Practice Project process?
Oh, I can say. Yeah, so along the lines of how it stretches you as an artist, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of what we're hoping to do is to find the right mode of art making to address an issue outside of the arts. So what that means is we're exploring new modes of music making that we didn't necessarily know, which meant that we're learning things like improvisation, how to write music in multiple different modes. So I guess what I can say here is doing this work forces your creativity into uncharted areas, and also within the arts and also outside, realizing that some of what you bring as an artist helps to convene conversations in new ways, helps to bring partners together in more effective ways, or even the process of making art together can open up emotional states in which other types of very difficult conversations can happen. So it's something that both changes how you work, but also makes other things possible. Anybody else?
Folks, these leaders have demonstrated how projects have cultivated meaning and inspiration, and their effective and memorable relationships in the community, and we have learned so much from you. And I hope that this discussion is going to further future conversations with any or each of these panel members or whoever you designate. I can tell from meeting them that they are all inherently both teachers and learners. I also want to express my appreciation to Opera America for your work in developing resources that empower civic practice with opera. You are strengthening the entire opera network. You're bringing creativity and innovation to communities of all sizes and shapes, and you are celebrating the power of opera. So thank you, and this concludes our session. Thanks.